Hello and welcome to a webinar organized by the Turkey program of the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy. My name is Yanis Grigoriadis. I'm an associate professor at Bilkent University in Ankara and head of the Turkey program at ELIAMEP. Today I have the pleasure to moderate a discussion on one of the recent papers produced by the Turkey program here at ELIAMEP. This paper is exploring a very interesting and complicated topic, Turkish foreign policy, and it has been co-authored by two excellent scholars, Erdi Öztürk and Can Selçuklu. Original idea was to have the two scholars here to discuss the paper, and then we have two excellent experts on the field of Turkish foreign policy who would discuss this. Unfortunately, Erdi is not able to be with us this afternoon due to last-minute illness, but we have a very good team, and I will also try to contribute to the discussion so that the paper gets the discussion it deserves. So I would like to first introduce our guests. We have Professor Sinem Açıkmese from Kadir Has University in Istanbul. And we have Professor Alparslan Özerdem from George Mason University in the United States. They will be discussing aspects of the paper. The paper is entitled Between Power and Paradox, Militarization, Defense Ambitions, and Turkish Strategic Struggles. And it has been trying to explore the transformation of Turkish foreign policy in light of recent global and regional developments, the transformation of the international order that we've been witnessing in the last few years in the aftermath of the rise of the Trump administration, the war in Gaza and the Middle East, the war in Ukraine, and all the consequences that they have brought about in what we understand as international orders. Turkey's position has been very interesting and distinct in that respect. So we have lots of things to discuss in the next 60 to 75 minutes. But I would first like to give the floor to Can Selçuklu, who is one of the co-authors of the paper. He is the managing director of Istanbul Economic Research. So his field is economics and social science research. So he covered these aspects of the paper. So I understand that he's going to discuss more of this in his presentation, but the rest of us will try to fill Erdi's gap by adding the more international relations and strategic affairs-oriented aspects of the paper. So I'll now first give the floor to Can. Can, thanks very much for the paper and for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Yanis. It's a pleasure to join the discussion today. So, as you said, I will focus more on the economic aspects of our paper, but obviously I will try to give the general feeling as well. Now, our paper examines Turkey's evolving role within a global order that is becoming more fragmented, volatile, and multipolar. When we think about Turkey, the discussion often starts with geopolitics, its position at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, its NATO membership, its role in regional crises from Ukraine to Gaza. But our starting point here is different. We argue that Turkey's ability to act as a stabilizer, mediator, or regional power even depends not only on its geography or its military assets, but it depends above all on its economic foundations, which obviously constitute an important pillar of this capacity. Today, strategic influence is defined by economic resilience, technological capacity, and institutional credibility. So the capacity to project power abroad to sustain a defense industry or act as a mediator in crisis is increasingly tethered to a state's ability to generate stable growth at home, to withstand shocks, and to innovate. And I would like to underline here to withstand shocks that might either be international, which we are becoming increasingly prone to today, but also domestic shocks as well. This is why we bring the concept of economic security and try to use this lens in this discussion. Very quickly, what I want to tell you, what I mean by economic security here is that I define it as within this context, as the ability of a state to pursue its foreign policy and defense objectives on the basis of resilient, diversified, and credible economic base. This basically means three things: macroeconomic stability, industrial and technological capability. This is not only pertaining to capacity to innovate, but also and upgrade value chains, but also being resilient to external shocks, whether them be political or geographical. And finally, the third pillar that I use within this context is institutional credibility, which is rule-based governance, regulatory clarity, and investor confidence. Now, when we look at Turkey through this lens, we see an important paradox. On the one hand, Turkey has genuine structural advantages, right? Its customs union with the EU, albeit all the problems that are associated with it right now, and the inability of the two partners to renew and deepen the agreement. Proximity to Middle East and Eurasian markets, and a vibrant entrepreneurial class. On the other hand, however, these strengths are persistently undermined by inflationary pressures, institutional fragility, and external vulnerabilities. And the macroeconomic instability that has been mostly highlighted by inflationary pressures that bring together cost pressures is the foundation of the macroeconomic vulnerability that the country has been experiencing since, I want to say, mid 2023. So the result is that Turkey often aspires to play a larger regional role than its economic base and that its economic base consistently supports. If I'm going over time, please stop me. I have around 5 or 6 more minutes.
No, please go ahead. No
okay.
problem at all.
Okay. So let me start with the structural contradictions, and let me illustrate what I mean by that with a few points. So for over 2 decades, Turkey's customs union with the European Union has been a structural advantage. It allows for integrated trade flows. For a while, it also supported investments coming in and has anchored Turkey in the European marketplace. At the same time, Turkey's geography has made it a natural hub for a trade corridor stretching from the Black Sea to the Middle East and North Africa. But these advantages are undercut by systemic weaknesses. Inflation has remained stubbornly high since 2023. Now we are starting to see the disinflationary program bringing down inflation gradually. But the most recent midterm economic plan of the government that was announced last week puts year-end inflation around 30%, which will go down gradually, but obviously that has a cost on the household, but more importantly for this context on the business side. Current account deficits have persisted, signaling that the economy consumes more than it produces in tradable goods. All this erodes confidence and raises Turkey's geopolitical risk premium, which means that foreign investors demand a higher return for every dollar they put in. So here the paradox is clear. Turkey's geography and institutional ties confer opportunity, but its economic fragility constrains its capacity to fully leverage them. So going forward, what this will mean, and I think when we're having this discussion, we should always keep in mind that probably at most in 2 years' time, Turkey will have another round of elections, presidential and parliamentary elections. So this means that going forward, Turkey will need to prioritize its defense investments, but also regional involvement. The second area where this paradox becomes visible is industrial competitiveness. Over the past decade, Turkey has faced a process of deindustrialization in key tradable sectors. productivity growth has slowed and total factor productivity has declined. Now, deindustrialization within the development story of a country is a phenomena that we see everywhere, right? It's not particular to Turkey, but the question here is, how do you manage or mitigate the risks of that industrialization, and in which sectors of the industry do you actually see that phenomena, and can you replace it with more technology involved sectors or more high value added professional services? So this matters because productivity is the foundation of long-term competitiveness, which Turkey is having a problem for the past 10 decades. Turkey's defense industry has become a symbol of national ambition. Think of UAVs like the Bayraktar, Kaan fighter program, the TCG Anadolu. These projects have attracted international attention, even admiration. And there's a very strong feeling of pride nationwide in this area, and rightfully so. But beneath the surface, they remain dependent on foreign engines, electronics, and semiconductors. In some critical subsystems, foreign dependency exceeds 70%. So this sort of creates the kind of vulnerability which we define under economic security. This shows the limits of ambition without economic security, like I mentioned earlier. A strong indigenous defense sector requires a broader innovation ecosystem, universities, R&D capacity, financing mechanisms that Turkey has yet to consolidate. And energy is the third pillar of this story. Despite diversification projects like Turk Stream and recent gas discoveries in the Eastern Mediterranean, Turkey remains heavily reliant on imported hydrocarbons. It constitutes a huge chunk of the current account deficit still. Energy imports not only widen the current account deficit, but also expose Turkey to global price shocks, which, looking at the way US administration deals with Russia or wider discussion of tariffs, is likely to, these global price shocks will be more of an everyday occurrence than we are used to. Now, we need to combine all of these with fiscal fragility. External debt is at a high level, and inflation is, as I said earlier, is coming down, but has been consistently high, which increases the cost for industries, and it makes the business environment very unpredictable. The Turkish lira has lost dramatic value over the past decades. All this raises the cost of important defense inputs, from jet engines to avionics, and undermines the financial sustainability of ambitious projects. In other words, without stable macroeconomic conditions, the defense sector risks outpacing the economy that is supposed to support it. But I don't, as mentioned in the paper, this is not only about financing the defense industry, but also this is about Turkey's active engagement in regional crises. So where does this leave us, right? Turkey clearly has genuine assets. It's geographically central. It has diplomatic agility, which it has shown, for better or for worse, ample times in the past decade. Its defense industry has achieved significant milestones, particularly in UAVs. But these achievements rest on fragile economic and institutional ground. To become a durable regional stabilizer and credible global mediator, Turkey must embed its foreign policy and defense ambitions in a foundation of economic security. So that means, stabilizing inflation, restoring investor confidence, investing in human capital, and strengthening institutions. It also means aligning defense investments with broader development and diplomatic objectives, rather than pursuing them as isolated prestige projects. Ultimately, Turkey's role in the evolving global order will be determined less by its geography or its rhetoric, and more by whether it can consolidate economic resilience at home. strategic autonomy and regional influence cannot be sustained without economic security. So this is a central message of our paper. Without reforms in governance, institutions, and economy, Turkey risks remaining a pivotal but paradoxical actor capable of moments of influence, but unable to sustain them over a long term. So let me perhaps stop my first intervention here. And if there are any questions or if there's a second round, or if I need to respond to the discussants, I'll be happy to come back into the discussion.
Thank you very much, John. That has been very, very interesting and comprehensive. There are so many issues you raised. I would like to maybe point to the concepts of economic resilience and economic security that you highlighted, which of course appear as permissive conditions for the sustainability of any steps, progressive steps in the development of Turkish economy, and certain sectors like the defense sector you kind of described. My question refers, maybe we can discuss it now, on the institutional side of this story. Like Turkey has been undergoing some political transformations on a domestic level, but I understand that there is an attempt to insulate these two sectors, right? Things happening domestically are meant not to affect Turkey's international ambitions, international image, or even Turkish efforts to sustain a lower inflation and sort of like deal with the structural problems that you very well described in your presentation. Is this realistic? And how can the popular response to the disinflationary pressures you described be factored into that? So the public opinion, does it have a role in that?
So the answer to your question is tricky, Anis, because if we were having this conversation, say, 10 years ago, we would probably say that, the institutional consistency, we would probably put more weight onto the subject and its potential impacts on, how not only Turkey, but any other country might be perceived in regional or more global issues. But now we are living in a world where it's becoming increasingly more transactional, and this institutional framework or consistency seems to be, pushed aside, sort of. So from that perspective, maybe it's not that big a problem as, we like to think about it, because, we are all, despite our maybe differing opinions on different subjects, we are on the side of lawful frameworks and, reliable, transparent, accountable institutions. But it's not necessarily the world we live in today. And, it seems that countries are increasingly less interested in each other's domestic setups. So I think my question there is that might not be that big an issue. On the other hand, in terms of public opinion, like I said in my first intervention, these defense capabilities that Turkey has developed, has been developing, I would say, since 1970s, but have really increased in the past decade or 15 years, are really an issue of national pride. That actually, and I might also say, this is one of the rare areas where you see unity almost across different supporters of different political parties. So it seems so far that the difficulties in economic conditions and the cost of living crisis and all that and high inflation have been isolated from the pride that is being felt by these developments. Although sometimes, even if it's a national project, in quotation marks, they are being highly politicized, especially during campaigning periods. So this was my long answer. My short answer to you is, what I would have said, yes, could be problematic for an administration 10 years ago. Now, I'm not speaking that confidently, because we are living in a very different world now.
No, I fully understand your point, and in a sense, many people studying Turkey are making a very bitter remark that many of the problems that Turkey used to face are faced by an increasing number of countries in the Western world in terms of institutions and sort of quality of sort of democracy and sort of backsliding. And all these discussions are unfortunately relevant to more countries than we could ever imagine a few years ago. So I very much understand your point. And I would like to follow up to what you said, actually. I would agree with this sort of high degree of popularity among the Turkish public opinion that these sort of initiatives or this rise of the Turkish defense industry is bringing about. I remember a set of surveys we ran at ELIAMEP a few years ago on Greek and Turkish public opinion perceptions. And one of the most striking findings we had was on how popular the concept of strategic autonomy was in Turkish public opinion across the board. So it was not just the pro-government supporters that sort of support President Erdogan's sort of solo international sort of actor role. These were also supporters of the opposition party that thought that Turkey should not identify itself with the West or NATO or the European Union when it comes to issues of national interest. And of course, this raises very big discussions and questions on the other side as well. You know, what sort of partner or ally is Turkey? Is Turkey an ally? Mm-hmm. What does alliance mean? You know, and as exactly you said, the transformation of international order in recent years allowed for Turkey to play that role. So in Ukraine, for example, it doesn't support the sanctions against Russia, but tries to play a sort of mediating role that no other NATO country is attempting, right? So, of course, Gaza is a different story. So Turkey has given up on this position, but again, it's trying to challenge Western views or Western positions on the Gaza war. And of course, then the international order becomes an interesting instrument in that respect. But of course, and I would agree with the finding of the paper, the main argument of the paper, that the economic conditions in Turkey play a very important role in permitting all these initiatives and all this sort of new attempts to project Turkish soft and hard power in the region and beyond. But of course, Turkey's relations with the West, the European Union, the United States, are having a critical role to play, even though we may be discussing that the West is declining and Turkey is trying to position itself in the new post-Western world. The West is still with us, and Turkey is very well embedded economically, politically, and strategically in the West. So it would not be easy or realistic even to make such a bold claim at this moment. But I would like to give the floor to Sinem on these issues. How do you think that this relationship, like Turkey versus the West, has evolved in light of all these transformations we've been describing on a regional, domestic, and international level? And where does Turkish foreign policy stand in that respect?
Thank you very much, Yannis, for inviting me to this event. And I also want to thank John and Erdi for that excellent paper. I read the paper. And I mean, before getting into your question, I have a few remarks about the paper, specifically about the political and security and defense aspects that Erdi would have mentioned here, apart from the alongside the economic aspects. Reading the paper, I was thinking about a famous dichotomy, which is the capabilities expectations gap in Turkish foreign policy. I mean, each and every person working on European studies has this dichotomy in mind while thinking about European integration. And I would like to talk about this specifically in relation to Turkish foreign policy. In the paper, there are two highlights from the paper in this respect. First of all, there are foreign policy roles. Turkey's assertion of certain foreign policy roles, such as Turkey as a balancing power, Turkey as a global mediator, Turkey as a regional stabilizer. Turkey as a military power with a specific focus on its growing defense industry. And Yanis, you mentioned the strategic autonomy. So these are the roles that are mentioned within the paper, but the paper does not say that Turkey fulfills this role. The second highlight is about the limitations in fulfilling this role. And they are very right and they are very accurate. The democratic backsliding, which we witness in Turkey for many years, specifically the last decade, I would say. And recently, the pressures, the repression over the opposition via the channels of the judiciary or the police forces and etc. I'm not getting into this, but this is one of the aspects that limits Turkey's strategic ambitions. Another one is economic vulnerabilities, and John mentioned the economic insecurities as well as the economic opportunities. And another one is the institutional fragility. So these are the two important highlights from the paper. And this brings me to my comment about this capability expectations gap. And then I will take the topic to your question, Yannis, how they are reflected in Turkey's relations with the West, Turkey's transatlantic relations, maybe we could frame it as such, or Turkey's relationship within NATO, or Turkey-European relations. So Turkey, the first aspect, Turkey is suffering from this capability expectations gap. Asserting something is, asserting itself is one thing, but achieving is another. So there are limitations on Turkey's capacity to act. They are not only domestic, but they are also in foreign policy sense. The paper mentions a lot about the domestic components, domestic aspects, but maybe I could give some examples about how the foreign policy ambitions do not meet the reality on the ground. And there is also an assertion in the paper that Turkey follows a transactional and a pragmatic foreign policy with diversified orientations. But this does not fulfill this gap, capability expectation gap as well. So some examples from the wordings that the paper used. I mean, first of all, balancing power. Is Turkey a balancing power? So in terms of achievements, I'm not going to criticize at all. I would also focus on the positive aspects as well. In achievement sense, Russia and West relationship, Turkey and the Russia-West relationship throughout the Russia-Ukraine war was kind of Turkey asserting itself as a balancing power. For instance, Turkey controlled the passage of the warships of non-littoral states, limited the passage via the Montreux Convention. So this was one balancing, behavior. Another one, Turkey brokered the grain deal. So, and Turkey tried to, host the meetings of the leaderships. And so it was kind of a self-balancing act. It was not kind of a full balancing power. For instance, I'm coming back to the criticism. Turkey is a country that hosts, still keeps, not hosts, keeps the S-400s, which is incompatible with NATO systems, NATO military systems. And so how can you be a reliable balancer when you keep Russian, S-400, Russia-originated S-400? So this is a trust-breaking issue from the Western perspective. So this is one aspect of Turkey and the West relationship. So this is one limitation in terms of foreign policy about the balancing power cliche. Or regional stabilizer. This is also mentioned in the paper. So is Turkey really a regional actor in its region? You know, Armenia-Azerbaijan negotiations under Trump, leadership, or Turkey acting in Syria. Turkish operations in Syria were, extremely criticized by Europe. And that was one of the issues that Western trust was broken towards Turkey. But on the other hand, Turkey claiming YPG, PYD components as terrorists, but West did not take them as terrorists and supported them. And right now, just after the fall of the, Assad regime and Turkey being in clash with Israel in Syria, I can give a couple of more examples, but, regional stability and Turkey acting as the stabilizer, I have my question marks over it. Global mediator, I'm not getting into mediation issues or how Turkey acts as a mediator while Alparslan Hoca is here. But, there are instances, of course, Turkey is acting as a mediator. Specifically, the example of the grain deal. But, I'm not getting into it, but I have my question marks over the mediation, global mediator role in quotation marks. Military power with a focus on defense industry. That is the bulk of the paper. So I'm acting in Erdi's role maybe, but this was the most important, significant part of the paper. And okay, Turkey has a growing defense industry. This is very important, but the paper also touches upon, I advise, the people who are listening to us to read the paper as well. They're talking also about the limitations in terms of technical issues, in terms of embargoes. So this is okay, Turkey's military power, but of course, when you compare it with other military powers, then what is the conclusion here? So maybe if Erdi was here, I would ask this question. Yes, Turkey is acting in Somalia, training Somalian soldiers. Turkey is in Kosovo, training, the soldiers there. Turkish army is, kind of overseas, not just in Turkey. But this military power, how does it give Turkey a role in foreign policy? Not a limited one, an overall one. So this is my take from the paper: capability, expectation gap, and Turkey. How Turkey does not fulfill those expectations. The paper touches upon the domestic reasons and the domestic justifications very accurately, and some foreign policy examples. I highlighted the foreign policy examples. Now, your question, Yanis, I touched upon some aspects, how trust is broken within Turkish-Western relationship or Turkey's relations with the transatlantic community. There are some ontological security problems. One is the definition of terrorism. How Turkey defines terrorism is way different than how the Western allies within NATO define terrorism. On the other hand, there is a quite criticism on Turkey about Turkey's somehow rapprochement with Russia. Turkey does not implement the Western sanctions against Russia. Turkey still has this S-400. So how trust can be rebuilt or built ever? And from the defense perspective, from the security perspective, Maybe first I could talk about Turkey's role in NATO and how this could be, further lead to more cooperation. And what is Turkey's EU relationship, and can it ever turn into a cooperation in the security sector? We know that Turkey-EU relations are not progressing politically and somehow economically, but there was a window of opportunity. There was, and how this can be talked about. How can this be discussed? Firstly, NATO. I have to start with saying that Turkey is the second biggest army in NATO in terms of manpower after the US, and France and Germany comes afterwards. So this is even a cliche to start a talk about this point, but this is very important. I mean, Turkey is the second biggest army within an alliance, and France and Germany follows. This is very important, and this is a way in which Turkey could contribute potentially to NATO. Secondly, budget-wise, Turkey contributes to NATO's common budget, and Turkey is the eighth among the 32 members of NATO. Also, Turkey does not have that big of a significant problem in fulfilling the previous NATO criteria on GDP allocation. Right in 2024, it was 2.1, around 2.1, and there's this 5% of GDP allocation to defense budget. But let's see how Turkey will proceed to that. Turkey contributes to NATO's missions. In Kosovo, in the Baltic and the Black Sea, the air defense, air policing missions, the anti-mine missions in the Black Sea, and NATO's response force. So these are the ways in which Turkey cooperates, and Turkey contributes to NATO. And Turkey hosts NATO structure as as all the allies do. As part of NATO's missile defense system, Turkey hosts a land-based radar in Kyrgyz. So these are the Turkey's contributions. And in terms of defense industry, I'm not a defense industry expert, not a defense expert. So, but the paper mentions a lot about this. And in terms of Turkey's support to the European allies, Turkey provides its defense products to Poland, to Spain, to Portugal, to Romania, to Croatia. So this is a way in which Turkey collaborates with the NATO allies as well. How can this be furthered? I mean, the broken trust issue, that stands, that cannot be solved easily. That's an ontological problem. That's an existential type of a crisis. But on the other hand, there's one technical issue. There's a NATO format about collaboration among defense partners, the firms, the DIANA initiative. It is the Defense Innovation Accelerator. So the firms of allies collaborate, and they advance their defense industry. So Turkey could, play a role in that aspect. Coming to the European Union, I would like to talk, this is my wish to talk a lot about security aspect of Turkey-EU relations, but you cannot differentiate the political problems which exist within Turkey-EU relations, which is the Turkey's domestic issues, Turkey's growing distance from European values and norms, and both at the political levels and societal levels. So this is a long story, and we could have another chat about this. Turkey-EU relations are not progressing. There was a window of opportunity especially with Russia-Ukraine war in terms of the security sector. But the domestic issues prevented that, closed that window of opportunity. There were lots of talks about how Turkey could be involved in the defense industry advancing of the European Union. So there is a, nowadays it's very, there's a lot of talk about Rearm Europe program, which is about defense allocations to EU member countries. And as a pillar of Rearm, there is this SAFE program, Security Action for Europe. And it's a defense loan program for countries who want to invest in defense production through common procurement. And there was a lot of discussion if Turkey could be a part of the SAFE program, if funds would be allocated to Turkey within that SAFE program. But Turkish companies are excluded from this program. Turkey as a partner country, as a candidate country, how you define Turkey within the context of Turkey's relations with the EU. Turkey is excluded, and the justification is that Turkey does not have a security agreement with the European Union. And Turkey cannot have a security agreement with the European Union because of especially because of the Cyprus issue. So Turkey cannot be part of that PESCO program. Turkey cannot be a part of any EU defense program right now. If there was this opportunity, Turkey, with its growing defense industry, would contribute a lot to the EU defense procurement systems, defense production systems. The collaborations would mean a lot for Turkey and would mean a lot for Europe. I'm saying this from a non-expert view, but from my readings, from what I hear from the experts, that is the case. So Turkey still relies on bilateral cooperation in the defense sector, in the security realm. An example could be Italy. So this is basically the case of Turkey, EU in the security realm. But coming back finally to, as a conclusion to your question, and I'm repeating what I have said throughout my talk, there's a crisis of trust in Turkey's relations with the West because of the presence of S-400. I mean, this is a technical issue, but it's a political issue. It's an emotional issue. And the support, or let me put it that way, the diverging definitions of terrorism from Western allies and from Turkey, the divergent views. And also, of course, Turkey is drifting away from European values is a huge disappointment for the West. So these are the issues that breaks the trust and not very easy to solve. So Turkey should proceed maybe to the transactional side and how it could develop the technical issues and how it can advance its, economic or security or defense aspects with bilateral relationships. This is the case right now. So I stop here and I'm happy to answer any questions, any comments.
Thank you very much, Sinem. It was very, very comprehensive, and you covered a lot of important aspects of Turkish foreign policy. Let me comment on a number of issues and then maybe ask you a question. You mentioned Rearm Europe, and SAFE, of course, is a very important and controversial issue. I think it also reflects yet another paradox of Turkish relationship with Europe and the West, right? Like the Cyprus problem, Greek-Turkish difficult relations on the Aegean have also added more layers of complexity and difficulties in developing this relationship further. So there are certain limits to what can happen given the current circumstances, although there is dialogue between Greece and Turkey, and there is an upcoming meeting of the two leaders of the countries in New York, these channels of communication have not come to the point of being able to overcome these long-standing obstacles to the further development of the relations that would have a positive effect on aspects of EU-Turkey relations as well. You very well highlighted the concept of capabilities, expectations, gap. This has been an issue for many years in Turkish foreign policy, I think, but it keeps on coming back with vengeance. So ever since, I would say, the Arab uprisings gave Turkey the opportunity to appear as the leader of the Muslim street in several Middle Eastern Arabic-speaking countries. We witnessed this desire by Turkey to be the voice of many silenced groups and peoples in the Middle East, but this appeared to be something that Turkey could not really manage. And at some point, the same government in Turkey decided to take a much more pragmatic view that was sort of shifting Turkish policy and sort of Turkish negative approaches towards certain regimes in the Middle East, be it in the Gulf or Egypt, towards a more pragmatic approach that was seen as a compromise of values that the government had put forward. My question on you would be on another important dimension of EU-Turkey relations that you highlighted. You talked about this concerns about the rule of law in Turkey, the sort of the respect for democratic and liberal values, given the developments there. My question is, to what extent are both sides willing to take a much more cynical or pragmatic approach of their relationship and agree to collaborate on certain issues of mutual interest and concern? I can bring migrations as an example. And at the same time, they could be willing to reduce the standards or the threshold or the yardstick of common values to a point that we would have never imagined a few years ago. So can we see a much more cynical EU-Turkey relationship than the one we were used to?
Thank you very much for your comments and the question. Actually, this transactional EU-Turkey relationship is on the agenda for many years, and even it became somehow official, not using the word transactional, but this positive agenda, or they are very creative in finding good words, good keywords for Turkey-EU relationship, but they were never realized. There were talks. Turkey was expecting a report on this, a comprehensive report on how to do that. EU officials were tasked with, writing or drafting such a report. But, it has not been received. Both sides are reluctant, because when you go to the transactional, then you leave the other parts aside. And the only transactional, the best transactional aspect for the EU is migration, as you rightly mentioned. But what if the migration issue is, in 5 years' time, 10 years' time is resolved, and then there's no need for Turkey? It is the only attachment right now. The security sector could be another attachment, but it is not happening. Of course, Turkey, EU has a customs union. This is very important. The economic aspect is very important. I'm not downgrading that. I'm looking at the political side right now. I don't want to give any names, but while talking to people in the EU, not high level, of course, the bureaucrats, they were saying that, even if Turkey fulfills all the political criteria, each and every political criteria, becomes a full democracy, respects human rights, minorities, all the, liberties and judicial freedoms, I mean, judicial reforms and everything. The Cyprus issue is the critical moment, is the critical aspect. If the Cyprus issue is not solved, Turkey-EU relations, Turkey cannot be a member. We are not talking about Turkey's EU membership right now, but Turkey's road to the EU is blocked because of the Cyprus issue, not because of Turkey's, growing distance from EU's values. Of course, this is the most important problem. I mean, the EU's political criteria and Turkey's fulfillment of the political criteria, for me, is the most important. For any Turkish citizen who wants to see Turkey as a full democracy, it is the most important. So I have my question marks. I don't have answers to your question, but I attach a lot of importance to the Cyprus problem as a stumbling block to Turkey's any kind of relationship with the EU. Even the talks on the customs union are attached to the topic somehow. Turkey's security contributions or participation in EU structures is limited by that topic, by that issue. So that's it.
Thank you very much, Sinem. Let me point here that we are happy to answer any questions our audience may have. So please use the social media channels to reach us or the email of the ELIAMEP. That will be very happy to convey these questions before the end of this event to our distinguished speakers. I would like now to give the floor to Alp. Alp has been an eminent scholar of peace and conflict resolution studies, and this is a field where Turkey has been developing a recent interest, and in regions of the world far from Turkish borders as well. Of course, one can say that that's another paradox or contradiction, given that Turkey has been involved itself in several disputes in its proximity, but on the other hand, it is remarkable to see how Turkey has developed influence and interest in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, and different parts of the world. So I would like to give Alp the opportunity to reflect on how the paper discusses this sort of Turkey's role as a mediator or a global actor. The floor is yours, Alp. Thank you very much for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you, Yanis, and good afternoon to you all. So absolutely, I'm more than happy to look at the paper from that peace and conflict perspective. And I must say, Yanis, you and Sinem and John have done the job easy for me because you explored some of these issues already, and you put them in relation to economy and security and the specific actors like the EU and NATO. And I was taking lots of notes while listening to my fellow panelists. And I think what I want to do here is that I want to certainly address the peace and conflict dimension and the matter of paradox within that context. But I think at the same time, I want to reframe the core question that we are discussing here. And that is, I want to do this not because the report kind of makes a particular assumption or the discussions here come from a particular perspective. It's just a kind of really being able to offer another dimension for our discussions, another layer of complexity, as if that we don't have enough, but just to kind of think about this paradox issue from a slightly different perspective. And that is, when we ask this question, often I feel that it somehow comes from a Western-centric perspective. So we question, why is Turkey paradoxical, right? But I think we should ask the question, who is not paradoxical today, right? Because I would argue that, I mean, I don't know whether we should look at a paradox as ultimately a weakness, I don't think it's unique to Turkey. I would argue that it's really the condition of modern geopolitics, the contemporary geopolitics, where competing imperatives like security, economy, values, power projection, they constantly collide. And then I don't think that is really just so, about Turkey and what Turkey is as an actor. So let me just kind of explain this a little bit before coming to the matters of more specifically peace and conflict. I think we are looking at some major global paradoxes, and we need to give a few examples of that, right? So, United States. I mean, I don't know whether we can still argue that, but as a country, the U.S. considers itself as a champion of democracy and human rights. But yet, traditionally, the US had no qualms about supporting authoritarian regimes for strategic reasons. Not now, but at least in the past, it talked about multilateralism, but often acted unilaterally, right? So, I mean, there are lots of paradoxes there in terms of the US and the way it engages in matters of peace and security. Since I'm talking about European Union, I mean, like another actor with many paradoxes. And some of the examples are just so kind of interesting. So on one hand, European Union is all about promoting climate leadership, right? And climate change and the role of EU in this and everything. And also really cares about human rights, the Copenhagen criteria and all that. But when it comes to buying energy from Russia, none of these seem to be a problem. Well, here it is, another paradox for you. And when it comes to this humanitarian values, human rights values, they are very important, but at the same time, barefoot migrants from Syria trampling the mountains of Central Europe in order to reach Germany and Sweden. Well, how would you explain that without really sort of referring this as a paradox, right? China, I mean, tries to promote itself through the Belt and Road program, right? The soft power. We are here for trade and all that. But then it's all about expanding military capacity. There are lots of, internal contradictions of its authoritarian capitalism, right? Russia, again, I mean, if you listen to Putin, it's all about the sacredness of sovereignty, right? But then Russia has no problem of violating the sovereignty of another state. Or India, I mean, they try to be very nice, when it comes to as a leadership of global South. We are not part of anything. We have a different kind of a message here. Well, but at the same time, India has very strong military links, both with Russia and the US, right? So the reason I'm saying is that all the powers pretty much have their own contradictions. So talking about paradoxes in Turkish foreign policy, I think that's first we need to question and why this is happening. I think that is the part I want to bring into our discussions. And there are a few points I want to make here, particularly in relation to peace and conflict matters. So, in the report, the Turkey's paradox is around, so it is part of NATO, it's a NATO ally, but also wants to act as an independent actor. Well, isn't this as a result of the way NATO behaves vis-a-vis certain conflicts or the security of its member states? So vis-a-vis Syria, for example, when Turkey felt really vulnerable, I don't think NATO really came forward, providing that security provision as it promised, right? So then, as a country, you start to look at other options, right? Or economic vulnerabilities. The other discussants made an excellent job to elaborate that, and the report looks at this issue. But my question is, vis-a-vis the kind of acting as the international mediator, stabilizer, state builder, or peace builder, this peace broker, all these different roles and the interventions. I don't think, the challenges with the kind of economic capabilities are necessarily a disadvantage here. So I'm looking at this from a more structural perspective, how international mediation should be vis-a-vis contemporary, the kind of security challenges. I don't think it's the kind of age now that we can still think about international mediation from the perspective of, oh, this is the job for international organizations like the United Nations, or this is the job for nice, rich countries like Scandinavian countries, Norway, Finland, acting as mediators. I don't think it's just kind of a job that for the powerful states like the US, EU kind of intervene and often intervene militarily. We need more actors like Turkey, like Qatar, like United Arab Emirates, like Saudi Arabia, like Brazil, like South Africa, because it really diversifies the way those actors, what they are able to bring to the international mediation table. So this rising powers in this field vis-a-vis traditional actors of international mediation and peacemaking. I've been observing kind of quite an interesting kind of struggle, between those actors. Not that I condone by saying that all these new actors are just so wonderful and bringing all kind of fresh breath of air, and what they do is amazing. That's not the point I'm making. But I think for so long, this particular arena has been left to the traditional actors, and I don't think, as we see around the world, they've been particularly successful, right? So in that way, rather than question Turkey's economic challenges vis-a-vis its capabilities around mediation, etc., in fact, this is not a weakness, this is an opportunity of creating constellations of partnerships for multi-party international mediation interventions. So places like Syria or Gaza or Ukraine, you really need to have a ally of international mediators, kind of countries that are prepared to do something about that, because the roles can be very different. Some of it around peacekeeping, some maybe more kind of like direct intervention in mediations and negotiations, that sort of third-party intervention. It may be about what will happen after the day after, right? Who's going to invest the money for reconstruction, peace building for these matters. So I think we are now in an age that we will need to look at international mediation from this perspective. That's the reality. So that's number one. Number two, I think when we talk about paradox question, whether this is Turkey or Greece or EU or US, I mean whatever actor it is, we really need to recognize the significance of time and context, because there are really two main informants. So the same actor may be acting quite paradoxically, sorry the banter here, but you will see different types of actors, although it may be, like intervention in an international conflict. So Turkey intervening in Ukraine is different and should be different than whatever not happening in Gaza. You know what I mean? So I don't think the expectation should be that in a very normative way, those actors will have only one way of engaging with all these complex issues. That's not the reality. I think we need to appreciate that the context and time will make us see those actors behaving differently. You can call this transactionalism sometimes, or perhaps trying to balance their capabilities with expectations, right? Especially for emerging powers. This is a moral reality because, yes, most of emerging powers have that sort of issue. So Turkey, Qatar, for example, work together because there's a complementarity. One has money, the other one has the military and more soft power. So they come together in places like Libya, for example, right? They try to work in Syria and the commonalities of their security needs. I mean, the problem starts really when this whole, the motivations of international mediation and peacemaking become the kind of like a pawn in the domestic politics, in that agenda. So, in that way, like then we start to see problems, why this is happening, how this is messaging, to domestic constituencies. The third point I want to make around this is, I guess they kind of like Turkey and the kind of the way it's trying to use is leverage. Paradox issue comes to discussions more often, and the report does a good job to highlight this. It's because I think it's visible because of its geography. I mean, it's not just the crossroads of geographies, but the crossroads of crisis. Pretty much, when you look at all the global crises today, I would say that like two-thirds of them happen in that sort of sphere of Turkey, right? Either Caucasus or the Balkans or the Middle East, or there are others, but it's that immediate geography. So that's the kind of the reality, and I think structurally, it really mirrors the dilemmas faced by all major actors. So in a way, then when we when we list our expectations from actors like Turkey, it will be a good point to acknowledge that some of this really come from the realities, like your earlier question, Yanis, to Sinem about Turkey-EU relations. And Sinem's answer, well, look, even Turkey had done all the kind of like homeworks around the political, accession requirements. Cyprus is still an issue. Well, and Cyprus is not an easy issue to resolve or transform, right? So then I think those actors try to find not, like the perfect solutions, but good enough solutions, one and a half type solutions and responses. And that's the reality of foreign policy making, isn't it? Right. So I think we need to acknowledge this, that kind of like in the context is like the Eastern Mediterranean, so much happening. It's not only Cyprus, but the interest in oil, gas, and the kind of economic interest, the relations between Palestine and Israel, and how Egypt will fit in that. What's the future for Lebanon? Are we going to see another civil war in Syria? Well, look, you got to address each of this issue, call this paradox, but there will be different ways of intervening. And then I think some of it may not be that tasteful, right? I call that as the reality of foreign policy making and implementation. It's not always according to our expectations. And then I think so. I don't want to sound like I'm condoning or defending a particular policy making here, but I just want to bring that extra level of complexity into our discussions, and how report can deal with that. So let me just conclude here. I think probably I'm well over the time I'm allocated, but I think what I'm trying to describe here is that successful powers are the ones embrace paradox as strategic flexibility. So rather than seen as a weakness, I think it's a strategic flexibility in relation to time and place and the context and the changing dynamics. I mean, look, when you have President Trump leading the most powerful country in the world, how would you even consider having the kind of strategic foreign policy making opportunity, right? The things can change very quickly, right? So that strategic flexibility, I think, is important to consider. So what I'm saying here is that, and I'll put this in writing, so I want to get it right. It's almost like, the hypothesis that, I want to kind of put forward. And that is, if paradox is the new normal of global power, that's what I've been kind of arguing, then Turkey is not exceptional. It is emblematic. So because of its geography, because of the kind of realities, right? So the measure of its future influence will be less about eliminating paradoxes. I think that's the wrong thing. That's my main argument. don't see paradox as a weakness, and more about mastering them better than its peers. Meaning, everybody, every actor in the international arena, they have their own paradoxes. But I think successful powers will be the ones mastering their paradoxes better than others. So that's how I want to end my, reflections on the report and also what I heard from my wonderful colleagues so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. And I think you give us a very path-breaking insight into a discussion that we've had about the concept of paradox and whether we have to learn how to manage them instead of trying how to eliminate them, because that might be a futile exercise after all. But then, of course, the question of effectiveness of these paradox management appears. And then my question to you, before we come to the final round of questions from the audience, refers to the role of domestic politics into that. So how can the intervention of domestic political consideration in foreign policy paradox management play a negative role? And in that respect, we can see Turkey again as an example, because the way that Turkey's involvement in sub-Saharan Africa disputes or conflicts is understood by the Turkish public is very different from Turkey's involvement in Syria or in Gaza or in Palestine, right?
No, and absolutely. So when it comes to effectiveness and vis-a-vis the kind of national politics, I think, like as long as there's international mediators, those who have the ambitions of taking up such roles, and Turkey is one of them. As long as they wear the nationalist hat to do this, I think they will fail badly, because really, if you are doing this for the sake of domestic politics, do you want to sell yourself as the international power, your starting point is just so wrong that you are not going to really achieve what you are going to say. So that's the short-termism, right? And then I think like there is no luxury like that in international mediation. As an trustworthy partner, like Sinem's point, she was looking at this more about the different powers, but trust kind of like both vertically and horizontally, you know, uh, will matter, if Turkey wants to continue with a sort of global peace broker role. So, in the case of Palestine, for example, domestic politics are such that, Erdogan can never kind of position himself, at least explicitly, kind of like as a neutral third-party mediator role. And that's why that has been excluded, from the table really badly. So you see UAE or Qatar or Saudi Arabia or Egypt, but Turkey is not there. And Turkey, I don't think will be there. However, when it comes to Nagorno-Karabakh, Israel and Turkey are perfectly okay. Talk about different ways of regional security, right? So, I see like what's going to happen against Iran and the kind of like the South Caucasus, the changing landscape there, right? So again, that's my point. In terms of effectiveness, even that I would question, like, vis-a-vis the domestic politics. So, I mean, by not talking to Israel, I think Turkey is missing lots of opportunities, for regional peace. I don't think it's going to be possible to think about the future of Syria now without engaging diplomatically with Israel, and how that's going to look like. But that's okay to do this in South Caucasus. So I don't see really either or kind of binary here. Again, context and time will inform some of these responses. Having said that all, the Turkish politics are such at the moment that it is just so open to manipulation. I mean, forget about the Turkish international peacemaking role, peace broker role. Even the current peace process, the Kurdish peace process, is almost like a PhD student of mine here was telling me yesterday. I like the term that he was using. rather than whitewashing, he was saying that this is peace washing of Turkish politics right now. Because when you think about like those some of the main actors engaged in this process, they are using the idea of peace to cover up what's happening or what's not happening politically in the country. Or, like, and I think in that way, your question is apt. The relationship between national politics and what happens outside. But even within Turkey, like when it comes to its own conflict and its own peace process, it is a victim of those national politics. It's not, those things don't have that kind of resilience long time. So if this continues like that, that's my prediction. We are not going to see the peace process in Turkey lasting anything later than December this year, unless they start to change their attitude about peacemaking in Turkey. Because, if this is about the future of some parties, the way they are positioned themselves and the way they want to kind of change the constitution, they want to use like the outcome of peacemaking for that purpose, you are not going to negotiate, in a way that will have that sort of transformational settlement. I mean, negotiations are never, a place to romanticize. After all, you negotiate for your interest, right? But I think when it comes to sort of like just for your own political survival, then that's just like another level, right? So what I'm saying in short, Yanis, effectiveness is a litmus test there, like in terms of the national politics, the way actors like Turkey engage in foreign policy, particularly in relation to peace and security matters globally.
Thank you very much. We have about 10 minutes before the end of the webinar. So we have 3 questions from the audience, one for each of you. So I will kindly ask to have about 3 minutes per answer. So the question for Alp refers to Trump's foreign policy. So the question is, what effect can this chaotic, non-rule-based and transactional-driven US foreign policy on Turkey's president choices on solving regional conflict? Can this signal a green light for a further securitization and militarization in Turkey's involvement in regional disputes around the world? The question for Sinem refers to the Cyprus prominent Greek-Turkish relations. You mentioned the significance of Cyprus in EU-Turkey relations. So the question refers to how important are Greek-Turkish relations and Cyprus in Turkey. I understand that the question may refer to a comparison between the significance of the topic in Greece versus the significance and the relevance of the topic in Turkey. And the final question for Can refers to the role of economy, and particularly in the defense industry, in producing new forms of nationalism. So can we talk about the techno-nationalism emerging in Turkey, sort of something that celebrates Turkish economic accomplishments in the defense sector as a new way of celebrating the Turkish nation? So I'll give the floor to Can first, and then Sinem and Alp will conclude. Thank you.
The short answer is yes. And I'll make 2 very quick remarks about this. And I think Alparslan Hoca alluded to this. In order for this to be successful, this whole attempt of Turkey, it needs to go beyond an instrument for domestic politics, and it needs to continue, right? Even if a new government comes in the next elections or the elections after, this certain policy needs to continue. On the domestic side, yes, it is creating it's definitely a strong sense of pride. And, I would speculate that it did play a very important role in the outcome of the 2023 presidential election. And let me finish by giving you the results from our latest nationwide poll, whereby we asked participants across Turkey to a representative sample about Technofest. Technofest is a new initiative, well, relatively new initiative by Bayraktar, whereby the aim is to bring young people together around a theme of technology and sort of create this Technofest youth generation. So 30% of our participants said that they never heard of Technofest, and 70% said they actually heard about it. So this is and they participated, some of them and not, but this is a high degree of awareness. Now, among the ones who are aware of Technofest, almost 70% said they find it important or very important for Turkey. So this means that this sort of socio-technical narrative that is underpinned by primarily by defense technologies goes a long way within the population. So the long answer to your question is also yes. Let me stop there, and we will publish this results of the survey very soon.
Thank you very much, John. Sinem.
Thank you for the question. Cyprus issue and Turkish-Greek relations, they are extremely inseparable. I understand the question that, is Turkey or is Greece, or could Turkey, could Greece, or the bilateral relationship could help to resolve the Cyprus issue. In an ideal world, Turkish-Greek relations should be solved through bilateral negotiation processes. Okay, and the Cyprus issue in an ideal world should be solved through mutual dialogues of the two communities there. So I'm separating the topics in an ideal world. And of course, a related topic, the Eastern Mediterranean, should be solved within the context of multilateral platforms, including law enforcement, international law enforcement mechanisms. So, but we are not living in that world. So those two issues are inseparable. And your question, Jan, is how it is perceived in Turkey, how it is perceived in Greece. Maybe you could comment on how it is perceived in Greece, but for Turkey, this is a national security issue, the Cyprus issue. So it has utmost importance when you refer to the national documents, national policies, but this is the official discourse. But how it's perceived in Greece, I'm relying on your comment here. So it's a very good platform to have a Greek perception and a Turkish perception. But still, Cyprus issue cannot be solved without Turkey or Greece getting involved in the issue. And there's a broader context, the European Union, because Cyprus and Greece are members of the European Union. Turkey is a candidate for so many years. So the perception in Turkey, the general perception in Turkey is that, this community has two members that we have problems with. And at the end of the day, they are the ones who would use their, veto card when it comes to membership. If the governments do not use the veto card, then the public might use it, while they are, either endorsed in the parliaments or, if there's a public vote in the future. So this is the perception, official plus mine.
Thank you very much. I think the point of the question was more on the asymmetry in the way that the two countries perceive the bilateral relationship. Greek-Turkish relations are more and more important in Greece. Turkey is Greece's main security concern. Turkey has a much bigger array of issues and disputes and security concerns to address. So in that respect, the argument could be that Greek-Turkish relations may not be as relevant or as important for Turkish foreign policy compared to 20 or 25 years ago, which of course has to do with Turkey's Western or European ambitions, because Greek-Turkish relations are also seen as a part of the package we discussed, right? So they are understood as a part of Turkey's EU ambitions, or sort of membership ambitions, or ambitions of developing a better relationship on this. So definitely this is the case. We had another question that had just been coming, so maybe I'll take the opportunity to ask it to you, Sinan, before I give the floor to Alp and conclude. There is a question about, from a colleague, actually, Jens Bastian, on could Turkey's participation in any European-led security force in Ukraine lead to political concession from the EU or NATO on safe? So is there such a hope or perception in Turkey that providing security services to international or European peace force in Ukraine may allow Turkey to recalibrate its position in vis-a-vis safe, or like its involvement in European defense?
Not that I know, and it's going to be a projection, and I'm in no position to project on such a topic. But Turkey is a security contributor to Ukraine through many channels, via many channels. The drone supporting, and also the corvette construction. In security wise, and Turkey providing military aid to, or military procurement to Ukraine. But this doesn't lead to any rapprochement with Europe in any kind of security arrangement. And the most important problem being that, again, Cyprus issue comes to the fore. There's no security agreement with Europe, with the European Union. Turkey does not have it. And as long as that agreement is not there, EU does not take Turkey into its security structures. Maybe there could be a way to negotiate, to change this, to take Turkey into types of defense, advancing defense industry, advancing systems. That would be beneficial for two sides. But that technical opportunity, way of advancing this relationship is not taken into consideration because of political concerns.
Yeah, and as you said, I mean, a breakthrough in Greek-Turkish relations could help that, but it has to happen first, and then all these positive developments can occur. Alp, the floor is yours. How can Trump influence Turkish foreign policy?
Living here in Northern Virginia, which is like literally 4 metro stops from DC, we feel obviously the impact of Oval Office in every aspect of our lives. And when it comes to the US foreign policy and in relation to Turkey, I mean, it's a really good question. And just in short answer is that one of the main advantages of Erdogan right now is that he seems to have the blessing of Trump for his regional kind of priorities. So there is a kind of like they seem to be in tandem, when it comes to matters of, broader kind of priorities. However, I think Turkey can continue that only by placing its relations with Israel at a certain place and a certain kind of like the constructiveness. And Syria will be the litmus test for this, because both Turkey and Israel have their own separate ambitions about the future of Syria. Whether it's going to be clash or cooperation, we'll get to see. And the US is doing the mediation work between those two countries. As we know, they are trying to get Israel and Turkey kind of have a similar agenda. And because when it comes to Nagorno-Karabakh, for example, as I said earlier, there's no problem. But the testing ground will be Gaza and Syria. and to some extent, yeah, Gaza and Syria, but particularly Syria over the next few months. So yes, the Trump's foreign policy priorities and Trump's support for Erdogan is important. But at the same time, I'm sure the palace in Ankara knows this, and they don't need my advice. But they shouldn't rely on that support and assume that that's going to be there forever, because the foreign policy making here in DC is very I don't know, incremental and kind of like changes by daily, and so you cannot rely on it. So what might be happening in 3 to 6 months may be quite different. And then I think the main leverage that Turkey can have is establishing certain type of relations with Israel. But vis-a-vis, Yanis, your point around domestic politics, that's a very hot potato issue, right? So how we are going to handle that, that's something else. Perhaps economic interest will remain and it's going to increase, and perhaps even the kind of like selling weapons or the drones, etc., doing it all that kind of at the background. But in front of people, it's gonna be like, you're my enemy, but different kind of talk behind the doors, right? But unless Turkey handles that carefully, I don't think Trump's support will remain there in the same way forever.
Thank you very much, Alp. And this brings us to the end of our long but hopefully enlightening webinar. I would like to thank the speakers. I would like to thank Can and Alparslan and Sinem for the very insightful contributions. I would like to thank the authors of the paper, Can again and Erdi, for bringing a very important contribution to a discussion of a very important topic. I would like to thank you again, our audience, for being with us this afternoon. Hopefully, we helped you understand some complex issues related to Turkish foreign policy. Please stay tuned for further webinars and events of the Turkey program of the Hellenic Foundation of European Foreign Policy. Thank you very much and have a good evening from Athens.
Thank you.